Thank you for joining me. As always, my name is the same. My name is Scott, and I work here with the Multicultural Association as an employment coach. And you're joining me today for the 9th presentation in a sequence of 11. And so tomorrow we have an additional session, our 10th, and it's going to go over Canadian workplace culture. But for today, we're going to be covering workplace standards and workers' rights. So what is this all about? Well, like many countries, most countries, there are some laws, some regulations that are put in place to help workers, to help employees on a much grander scale. So making sure that you have all of your rights as an employee, as a worker, making sure that nobody can discriminate against you for a multiple of reasons. It ensures your safety, it ensures many, many things, but at the end of the day, it's inviting to have a workforce that can always have a backup plan or people to talk to if things are going poorly for them. Okay, so we're going to talk about what your standard rights are, your rights are, and what the standards working in Canada are like. All right. So what are workplace rights? Canadians have the right to be treated fairly in workplaces free from discrimination, and our country has laws and programs to protect this right. The Canadian Human Rights Act is a broad-reaching piece of legislation that prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender, race, ethnicity, and other grounds. Also, Canada's Employment Equity Act and the Federal Contractors Program require employees to take active measures to improve the employment opportunities for specific groups of people. Okay, so what does that mean? Let's break it down to a little bit more here, all right? So we just talked about the Canadian Human Rights Act. I just mentioned it. It's a law that prohibits discrimination in employment and services within federal jurisdiction. Under the Act, Canadians are protected from discrimination when they are employed. All right, so break it down into some easier terms and some easier knowledge. It means that employers and service providers must ensure that all employees are treated equally. All right, that's really what this is at the end of the day. You cannot be discriminated against because of your race, your nationality, your color, your gender, your age, your religion. There's no room in any employment where you can be discriminated against because of these reasons. You cannot be paid less because of your gender or your sex, all right? For many years, there was a massive disparity or an unevenness when it came to the pay for women versus men in similar roles. This is not legal here in Canada. There's no option for that to be the case, okay? If you ever find that there is a pay discrepancy or a pay disparity, you can absolutely report that and it will be investigated. So the whole idea is that these things are put in place so that if you ever encounter it, there is someone or something that can be done to help your case, okay? You cannot be harassed or humiliated. You cannot be on the receiving end of unwelcome jokes. So if somebody makes a joke about your appearance or any of the grounds that we've talked about, namely race, nationality, color, it's illegal. These things are put in place. These acts are put in place. These policies, these legislations, these laws are all there to protect you and who you are as a person, okay? That's the most important thing to mention here, is that these acts have been in place for a long time and they constantly get edited and changed to accommodate more and more people. I'm sorry, just give me one quick second here. Can you ask that question again? Did someone make a comment? No? No. Interesting, weird, okay. I thought I was hearing something, all right. Moving on. Next, we have the Employment Equity Act. Okay, so just another fancy word to talk about an act, all right, or a law, legislation. The Employment Equity Act is a federal law that requires federally regulated organizations and businesses to provide equal opportunities. Okay, so There are 4 groups of which this falls into: women, Aboriginal peoples or indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, or members with visible minorities, who are visible minorities. So let's break this down even a bit further, okay? What does it mean? What does that act really mean at the end of the day? It means that regardless of your background or your unique identifiers, your sex, your age, your religion, whatever it is, everyone must be given the same employment opportunities. Okay, so it's a bit different than the Human Rights Act, where it's all about avoiding discrimination. Nobody can be mean to you or rude to you or say unwelcome comments about who you are as a person. This act talks about how everybody should be getting the same opportunities of employment. All right. So here's an example. This law would allow a white Canadian male, for example, myself, to have the same employment opportunities as an Indigenous female, or the other way around. All right. Indigenous female is just an example, but it could apply to many newcomers who are not local to Canada, right? They're all supposed to have the same employment opportunities. So if I'm applying for a job and somebody else in this presentation is applying for the exact same job, there cannot be any discrimination or limiters because of the unique identifiers. All right. So perhaps you have a different skin color, perhaps you have a different religion, or whatever your background is, there cannot be any discrimination, and you have to have the exact same employment opportunities, right? So that is a law. Any discrimination against one or the other, so in the example here, a white Canadian or Indigenous female, can be reported, all right? And again, can be investigated, and there's a lot of things that can be done about that. There's one important thing to note here, okay? And it's that an employer is expected to make a decision on whether they want to hire you or not based on professional capabilities only, not physical or spiritual identifiers, all right? It needs to be about professional capabilities. So if one person is more likely to get a job because of their professional capabilities, how good they will be at the job, that is the only thing that can allow an employer to make a decision. All right, that's the whole point of this. Can't be physical, can't be spiritual, but it has to be based off of your background, your experiences, your knowledge, your skills. That's what's going to decide if you get the job or not. I'm going to take a quick second and talk about this on a more candid level. And what I mean by that is I'm going to be talking more honestly. All right. These are things that are set in place. However, the real question is, how often do these laws get followed? Right? That's what we all really want to know. There's still discrimination in the workplace. There's still people who hire based off of people's skin color or background. The whole point is that that is not allowed, and people will still do it. It's that you take note and you report it, because that's the only way that these things are going to change. Okay, so yes, in the workplace, there is still racism, there still is sexism, there's a lot of different issues that still happen with Canadian employers and all over the world, all right? But there are authorities and people who can help if those things happen to you, okay? So I don't want to make it seem as if Canada has the best set of employers who don't discriminate. It happens. People are people. People can be mean, people can be rude, people can be uninformed. But there are really good places, or sorry, acts and laws in place to help you. All right. So here are some rights for workers that apply to everybody, okay? Canadian laws protect every worker in Canada, including permanent residents, including foreign workers, including a lot of employees who are foreign to Canada, newcomers, all right? You're not excluded from this. So these rights, you have to be paid for your work, right? That is a right that everybody has. You have to have a safe workplace. You cannot be working in a dangerous setting. If you are working in a dangerous, unsafe workplace, that's something that can be changed, all right? And also the workplace needs to be free from discrimination. So these are workers' rights that apply to absolutely everybody in Canada, all right? Whether you're a permanent resident or a foreign worker, these are standardized. We're going to talk a bit more about your rights as a working newcomer. So a lot of these things certainly apply to Canadians, Canadian citizens. It was created in Canada for Canadians, but it also applies to newcomers, and we're going to break down the newcomer side a bit more here, okay? These are some things that, as a newcomer, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept. If I say an employment contract, it's a contract that you sign with your employer, but these things change depending on what country you're coming from. They're different all over the world. So we'll talk a bit more locally. We'll talk about Canada. I'll mention a few things about New Brunswick, but take note of these because they're important and they will apply to you. Okay, employment contracts, a concept that I think we all understand, but let's go through it anyways. So for many jobs, you have to sign an employment contract. If you have a contract, it should include the following: details of your job duties, what you're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis, the conditions of your employment, all right? The number of hours you will work in a week. So let's say you work 40 hours per week, that will be stated clearly in your contract. It'll also state how many hours you will be paid for your work, all right? And additional to this, it'll mention a bunch of different things, but the contract is binding to you and the employer. The laws on hours of work and overtime depend on the province and territory you're working in. So in Canada, there's 11 provinces and territories. They're different in each of the different provinces or territories. So it's important to take note of that. The amount of overtime that you can do can change between here or Nova Scotia or Ontario. Those are very important. That's why you need to take a look at your contract. And if anything is different, you need to have a conversation with your employer about, but they will be different depending on what province you live in. Your contract will also have details about any money coming out of your pay. For example, for programs like the CPP or employment insurance or taxes. So it'll have a very clear breakdown of what you can expect to have taken out of your paycheck. Canadian pension plan. The Canadian pension plan is an amount that's taken out of your paycheck every 2 weeks or every month, whenever you get paid. That goes into pensioners, so retired folks, right? There is a collective amount that's given to all of the retirees or the retired folks in Canada, all right? And that's what their living wages are paid out of. So everybody helps the elderly. Employment insurance and taxes, these are standardized, and it will clearly say what your breakdown will be, all right? So that's essentially what the government, whether federal or provincial, is taking out of your paycheck. The main piece here is to always keep a copy of your contract for your records. Let's say you are signing an employment contract with a new employer, a new organization that you're going to be working for. You make sure that you go over the contract with them very clearly, that you highlight some details that are interesting that you want to have a conversation about, and you always keep a copy for the future, all right? Because if anything ever changes in your workplace, you can always bring back the contract and say, well, no, this here was different than it is here, okay? What happens if you lose your job? Okay, you have been working for this organization for a few months and you've lost your job. Let's talk about that a little bit. So in most cases, your employer needs to give you a written notice before your last day of work, okay? It's called a notice of termination, and the pay is called termination pay. So let's say you've been working for this organization, we'll say 5 years. They would need to give you notice, okay? They would have to say, we are letting you go, or you're being terminated, and here is how long you have left with us. Let's say it's a month, 2 months, 2 weeks. They must let you know. They cannot just let you go for an undue reason. However, there are some exceptions to that, okay? Let's say your employer lets you go for just cause, all right? That is okay. They can let you go. They can fire you at any time for just cause. Let's talk about what that means. If there's a serious misconduct, all right, let's say you're stealing or you're doing something illegal, that's grounds for just cause of termination, all right? They can just fire you without any notice at all, all right? You've been there for 20 years, for 30 years, for 5 years, however, you're stealing or you're doing something illegal, you're not showing up for work. These things can allow the employer to terminate you without any notice, okay? So keep that in mind. If there's no reason to let you go, all right, apart from the fact that they are just trying to change the staff, or they've lost their budget, whatever reason, they have to let you know. Okay, so just know that there's a difference there. If you have a contract for a specific period or a specific job, your employer does not have to give you notice when your contract ends. Okay, so here's another example of when an employer does not need to tell you that you're going to be let go. Because in your contract, if you remember, you signed a contract, and if your contract says that you're going to be working from this day to this day, you already know that your job is coming to an end. So they don't need to give you any notice. You sign the contract that says, I'm going to be working here for 6 months. I'm going to be working here for 1 year. Once that 1 year ends, they don't need to let you know. The job is ending. And that was something that was agreed upon at the beginning. If your employer does not follow the law when they dismiss you, you can complain to your local labor standards office. All right. So if you feel that you're being discriminated against and that's the reason your employer is letting you go, you can file a complaint, and people will look into that, have an investigation, and see the real reason of your termination. Okay, so keep that in mind. The whole point of this slide is to let you know that your employer certainly can let you go if you've been doing illegal things, if you've been stealing, for example, right? Or your contract is ending. However, if there's no real reason to let you go, you've been doing a good job, and you feel that you've been terminated unfairly, that's when you can absolutely bring it up to your standards office and ask for an investigation. Okay, that is your right. All right, next thing to consider, is your work safe? All workers in Canada have the right to a safe and healthy workplace. There are laws to protect workers from danger. It is also the responsibility of the employer, your employer, to ensure that employees get the right tools and training to avoid injuries, all right, or unhealthy workplaces. So to help you decide if your workplace is safe, you need to ask yourself while on the job, have I been properly trained for the job that I'm doing? If you're doing something dangerous, do you have the tools that you need? Have you been trained? Have you gone through the right amount of training? Have I been given the right safety equipment to do the job? If you're being asked to do something that requires you to have a helmet or gloves or something, it can be, protective eyewear. Have you been given those tools? Do you feel unsafe when you're doing your job? Do you work close to dangerous materials? These are all questions you should ask yourself. And if you don't feel that your employer is giving you the right tools or the right training, that is something you have to bring up to the employer. And if the employer is not willing to help you, you can bring that to your labor standards office again for another investigation, right? Again, the point is not that every employer is going to be safe to work for. It's that you have somebody to reach out to if these things happen, right? And you will be supported, absolutely be supported. Most of the time, you have the right to refuse work if you believe it is dangerous, okay? And here is the important part to note about this. If you feel that the work that you're doing is dangerous, you can refuse, say, no, I don't want to do this, and the employer will still have to pay you, okay, while you're waiting. If you don't want to do it, you're refusing work because it's unsafe and you have a good reason to say that it's unsafe, the employer will still have to pay you, okay? You are still at work, you're just refusing to do something that is unsafe, all right? The employer must continue to pay you until the danger has been rectified or removed. You feel that the problem does not exist anymore, so the employer fixed that issue, or a government official says that it is actually safe and that you can certainly go back to work without any issues. Okay, so those are the three determinants of whether or not your workplace will be safe and if you're going to be paid for it. So I'm just going to leave this up here for a quick second, okay? This is your contact point, all right? So I was talking about your employment standards. This would be a phone number to contact for Fredericton. So it's local, of course, and there's toll-free number there as well that you can contact. So an important number to take note of course, you can find this information online if you don't want to write it down right now, but all you'd be looking for is labor employment standards, and it's part of the post-secondary education training in labor. So yes, like I said, I'll leave this up for a quick second for those who do want to jot it down. This contact here would be who you would call if ever you were facing discrimination, if you felt anything was going against the Human Rights Act or the Employment Equity Act, if you felt that your work situation was unsafe, anything like that. These are the people you would contact. Okay, so let's talk a bit about New Brunswick, all right? Like I said, their standards, they change all over the world. They change all over every province. So let's talk a bit about workplace standards in New Brunswick specifically, because that's where we are. Okay, so minimum wage in New Brunswick. Minimum wage in New Brunswick is $12.75 per hour. That's as of April 1st of last month, sorry. All right, so April 1st, 2022, the minimum wage was $12.75. That means that you cannot be paid less than $12.75 no matter what. All right, if somebody's offering you less than that, it's illegal, right? You can report that. The minimum you can get paid for overtime is $19.13 per hour. All right, so that's additional hours that you're doing over what your contract states. So let's say your contract states that you have to work 40 hours. Once you've reached 45 plus hours, you would start getting overtime pay. So instead of $12.75, you'd be getting $19.13 as a minimum, okay? Hours of work and overtime. So overtime after 44 hours per week, that's a standard, all right? So if you work 46, 47 hours per week, you'll be getting 3 hours of overtime, 2 hours of overtime, okay? Of course, if you're working 40-hour week at 44 hours, you're still gonna be getting paid your regular minimum wage, if that's what you're making, but only after the 44 hours will you be receiving overtime rates, okay? Maximum of 6 days per week is the standard, right? So you cannot work more than 6 days per week. You are supposed to be given a day off, okay? That is the legal requirement. If you choose to work personally more than 6 days, that is your own choice, okay? But an employer cannot force you to work more than 6 days per week in New Brunswick, all right? If you are trying to make money, I'll give you an example. For myself, I have 2 jobs. I work here at the Multicultural Association. I also work with the military, and there are days, there are weeks that I work 7 days a week. There are weeks where I work 14, 21 straight days. That is a personal choice. I cannot be forced to go and do work by my employer, all right? But if I want to, I can work as much as I want. So just take note of the difference there. You can't be forced, but you can certainly work more than 6 hours per day if you want. Provincial statutory holidays. So there's 8 days that you will be given. Statutory just means that it is standardized. Everybody will be given these days. They are New Year's Day, Family Day, Good Friday, Canada Day, New Brunswick Day, Labor Day, and Christmas. Those are the 8 days that you will be given regardless of where you are employed, okay? Your employer might still work these days, but these are standardized statutory holidays that are available for everybody. If you want to work on these days, sometimes your employer will say, yes, you can, okay? The standard in New Brunswick for any employer is compassionate care leave, which means if you have to take care of a family member, if a family member died, these are some of the standards in place. 3 days per year for family responsibility leave. It is unpaid, okay? But you can take the time off. So let's say you have a child who is sick. You can take 3 days off to accompany that child without any questions asked, okay? Bereavement pay, that talks, bereavement leave, that talks about you taking time off for the loss of a family member. You can be given 5 days without any questions asked. That's the standard, okay? And the standard for the amount of sick days per year is 5 days per year after 90 days of employment, so 3 months of employment, okay? Again, no questions asked, 5 days per year is what you have allotted to you. Depending on where you work, it can be more, and it also doesn't necessarily mean that it is unpaid. However, this is the law here. It is the standard, the absolute minimum that you can be given, 3 days for family responsibility, 5 days for bereavement leave, and 5 days of sick leave per year, right? This is where companies differentiate themselves and they try to attract talent. They'll give more sick days. They'll pay for sick days. They'll give more family days. They'll give more bereavement leave. These are all things that can be enticing. They're called benefits. Okay, so keep that in mind, but this is the minimum that you can be given. All right, maternal leave. So let's say that if you're a woman and you're pregnant, or a male and you are going to be a father, you can be given maternal or paternal leave, parental leave. And here are the limits, or sorry, the minimums. Okay, so 17 weeks of maternity leave, all right, is the very minimum that you can be given. 62 weeks of parental leave in total. The maximum of 78 weeks combined maternity and parental leave. What does that mean? I can break that down a little more. So in New Brunswick and in Canada, if you are the mother, and you have a partner who is the father, you can split up the amount of days taken off or amount of time off. Okay, so if you want to take half the time as the mother and you want to give the father the rest of the time off, that will be parental leave, and you can both take a certain amount. Let's say as the mother, you want to take 75% of the weeks. You can do that and leave the 25% to your husband. You can split it up, but these are the minimums that you can be given. I don't know why I keep skipping, sorry. All right. Last thing here is termination of employment. So for just cause, remember we talked about that. If there is good reason to let you go, all right, they need to give you 2 weeks notice after 6 months of working there. All right. So if you've been working there for 6 months or more, they must give you 2 weeks notice before letting you go, before essentially terminating your employment. If you've been there for 5 years, they need to give you 1 month or 4 weeks notice. All right. So in between 6 months and 5 years is 2 weeks. Anything above 5 years is 4 weeks notice. So 1 full month notice before terminating your position. That gives you a chance to organize yourself, try to find other work, to not be left without income, right? That's the reason for that. All right, let's briefly talk about deductions. So we talked about at the beginning, taxes, CPP, deductions of many sorts coming out of your paycheck. These are to be expected. You will see them. You will receive a breakdown of the money, the amount of money that is deducted from your pay. If you're not receiving a document like this, it's your legal right to request for it. Okay, it's called a pay stub, right? And it should have a breakdown of what you've earned versus what is being deducted. Okay, if you're not receiving that, you can ask your human resources or your manager for the pay stub, but it is something that every company, organization, employer needs to provide to you. Typical deductions are federal income, CPP, which is the pension plan, EI, employment insurance, and then group insurance plan. So federal income, what does that mean? Federal income is a tax that is taken out of every Canadian's paycheck on a federal level, the maximum level, to help pay for our free healthcare, for example, right? CPP, like I said, the pension plan, all right, the Canadian pension plan is for the elderly that are retired. The income that is sitting in the pension plan is offered to them to continue their lifestyle, to keep living, to afford life without working. EI, employment insurance, has to do with people who are unemployed. So the hope, the goal of Canada is to have the least amount of unemployed people as possible, but it's not going to happen. Employment insurance is an amount that's deducted from your paycheck to help pay for those who are unemployed, transitioning between jobs, not making any income, okay? Group insurance plans. Let's say your employer offers you benefits and they cover your health insurances, your dental costs, your medication costs, these kinds of things. That can also be a monthly deduction or a biweekly deduction off of your paycheck. All right. So let's take a look here at I would say, typical pay stub. All right, you'll have the name, the pay period. You'll have the amount that you're earning versus the hours that you've worked. typically, okay? So the hourly rate and the hours worked. And then on the right side will be the deductions. So you'll see CPP, EI, tax, healthcare, all these things, and it'll be a breakdown of the cost of each of those in a dollar value, right? And at the end, you should have a summary of what your deposit is going to be after deductions. Okay, so this is the standard. This is what's going to happen in New Brunswick and in all provinces as well. All right, a couple of FAQs of frequently asked questions. Is an employee entitled to a rest period each week? The answer is yes. All employees are entitled to a weekly rest period of at least 24 consecutive hours, if possible on a Sunday. The only exception to this is where the employer is required to cope with an emergency or the employee is not usually employed for more than 3 hours in any one day. Okay, so this first part here that I'm just highlighting right now, if there's an emergency, you work in an emergency stricken field, right? You're a nurse, you're a doctor, you're a paramedic, you're a firefighter, you're a policeman. If there is an emergency that your employer, that you're expected to cover because of your job, that is the only way that you can be asked to work on a day where you would normally have off, okay? So remember I was talking about the 6 maximum days. You can be asked to work on a 7th if there is an emergency, but it depends on your work, okay? Certainly depends on your work. It's typically law enforcement, healthcare services that can fall into this category. Do employees have to be paid for training hours? Good question. Depending on the circumstances, training hours may be considered regular hours of work and may be required to be paid, unless the training is a prerequisite for employment. So here this is saying that it depends. It depends. It all depends on your employer. If your job, your new job requires X amount of days of training, the employer will decide if they pay you or not. So what is that, the importance of that to you? Well, it should be something that you ask before trying to take a job, right? Do you pay for training or do you cover the cost of training for X number of days or weeks? If they say no, you might want to reconsider because that essentially you're working on unpaid time. If the employer says yes, you can see that they have probably a good relationship with making sure that the employee is covered financially, that they're taken care of, all these things, okay? And the last question here is, are employees entitled to food and rest breaks? Yes, of course. All employees are entitled to food and rest breaks as required under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So depending on your employer, at a minimum, you should be receiving an hour per day, all right? So the breakdown of that doesn't necessarily matter, but you should be getting, let's say, 2 15-minute breaks and a half an hour lunch at the very least, right? Some employers, they'll do 1 full hour lunch, no breaks. It really depends on the employer, okay? But yes, everybody is entitled to a food and rest break. Now, this is the end of the presentation. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening to me talk, and hopefully you've learned a little something. As always, I'm opening the floor to any questions that you might have. And it doesn't necessarily have to be only employment standards and safety based. You can ask me really anything that you want, okay? There we go, okay. Yes, so any questions, anybody, if you don't feel comfortable asking the question openly, you can type out your question and I can answer it. And if there are no questions, then we'll probably just end the session. But yeah, whichever you guys prefer.